Thank you. Hope you feel the same way at the end.
Thank you very much for coming. I thought I'd start with a relatively simple question. Most of us here won't know what it's like, so could you tell us what a day in the life of the Speaker of the House of Commons is like?
There's a certain pattern and predictability to the day. We have a thing students call the briefing meeting, which takes place at various times on a Monday at midday, Tuesday at 10:30, Wednesday at 10:30, Thursday at 8:45. And that meeting is with the clerks who sit at the table in front of the Speaker, and the Speaker who chairs that briefing meeting is accompanied by the deputy speakers and a sprinkling of other officials. And the purpose of that meeting is just to run through the business of the day. That is an absolutely unvarying feature of a sitting day, that you go through the business, you anticipate what might come up. I will make decisions on any amendments that need to be selected to motions at that point, and I have a very keen sense then of what's likely to unfold, subject, of course, to the unpredictability of the debate itself. You can't be sure what will happen in the debate and where somebody will say something that is disorderly, that will prompt an intervention from the chair, but that's a standard feature. Aside from that, I would say typically I would be expected to be in the chair in the chamber for 3 hours a day, which may not sound very much, but it was for me very much to be regarded as a sort of de minimis threshold, ordinarily exceeded. In other words, students, for better or for worse, and you'll make your own judgment of my tenure, I took the attitude, Gabriel, that I would rather be accused of hogging the chair than of being an absentee landlord. So 3 hours was the minimum. I tended to be in the chair somewhat more than that, sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours. The maximum I ever did was 14 hours without a break, without a visit to the loo, without the consumption of a meal. And that was because I felt that day, out of respect for my colleagues and the significance of the arguments on Brexit, wanting to hear every point of view expressed and everybody expressing it, I would try to be there from start to finish. And I was there I didn't announce it in advance because I didn't know whether physically I'd be up to it, but I was there from 11:30 in the morning to 1:30 the following morning. Those are standard features of the day, and then interspersed with those very standard features of the preparatory meeting and then the chamber activity, the two other staple features of the week for the Speaker are meetings with colleagues who wish to see the Speaker. They might want to apply for a special debate on a subject. They might want to come to see me to request permission to use the staterooms of Speaker's House for a charitable event. They might come to advise me of a problem that they've got in raising a particular matter in the chamber. Is there some way in which I can advise them how to be more successful, etc. Similarly, meetings with staff from various directorates are absolutely commonplace. I've got to keep in touch with what's going on across the estate, because one thing people don't understand is that the Speaker is not just chairing in the chamber. That is the best known and most visible function of the Speaker, but the Speaker is also chair of the House of Commons Commission, which is the strategic governing body of the House, responsible for its staff, services, and the property of the parliamentary estate. So I'm a kind of non-executive chairman of the board, if you like. So I have to know what's going on in the catering department, what's happening in building, what's happening in visitor services, how we're doing in terms of parliamentary education with schools, what is going on in the parliamentary outreach department, and so on. So I'm regularly meeting departmental heads, as well as, of course, key figures in the House, the leader of the House, the shadow leader of the House, the government chief whip, the opposition chief whip. And that really effectively captures what the Speaker does on the estate. Aside from that, I would say one other thing, and that is that Gabriel, made a point of doing a lot of outreach activity, which hadn't been the norm prior to my tenure as Speaker. So I resolved very early on that I'd like to get out beyond the parliamentary estate, particularly on Fridays when the House is usually not sitting, to visit schools and universities and voluntary organisations, Why? Well, to talk about politics and democracy and the role of the Speaker and how we operated, in what way Parliament was changing, how people could access the political process, and why it all mattered. So I would broadly describe that as a kind of ambassadorial role. I tried to be an ambassador for Parliament and a robust advocate of democratic politics, and that really summarizes what I did to the best of my limited ability.
And as the national political temperature rose, did that schedule break down? I mean, you mentioned the Leader of the House of Commons. Your relationship at times became a little fraught.
Well, I had mixed relations over a long period with leaders of the House, far more good than not. I think I interacted with 7 leaders of the House during my tenure. It was either 6 or 7, I think it was 7. And I had good relations with a number of them, average relations with a couple, and on the whole, good relations with Jacob Rees-Mogg. I mean, Jacob and I ended up often disagreeing about matters towards the end, but I would say, students, that would be characterized as honourable disagreement. Jacob had a particular view as Leader of the House about the imperative of the early delivery of Brexit, though it should be added, he himself voted against the Theresa May Brexit deal on 2 occasions, so insofar as Brexit didn't happen, and he nevertheless complained about delays to Brexit, I can only assume that his complaints were at least partly autobiographical, as he himself had caused some of the delay. But Jacob felt that Brexit should be delivered, and his thesis, if you will, was Parliament's no right to stand in the way. Parliament shouldn't be obstructing it, Parliament shouldn't be slowing it up, Parliament shouldn't be arguing the toss with the government. And that was his honest and honourable view. And I would often say, yes, but there was a referendum, but it is for Parliament now to interpret that verdict and to decide what legislation to pass and whether it needs to be revised, amended or improved and so on, and that is a very proper and legitimate function of Parliament. But I would say my personal relations with Jacob were very good. My relations with Andrea Leadsom as Leader of the House were not good. I would say that...
They were bad?
Yes. I would say that... I think to be accurate, that Andrea Leadsom and I had a relationship characterized by trust and understanding. I didn't trust her and she didn't understand me. And she was the least capable holder of the office in my time as Speaker. Sorry, but I mean, she was the least capable Leader of the House. Her grasp of procedure was poor. I didn't find her very collegiate. And, you know, she's entitled to her views about me, but she has tended on the whole to suffer from the quite material disadvantage of being wrong.
I'm sure we can tell her that as, when, and I think now if she agrees to speak here. You've brought us on quite neatly to those days around prorogation. And I was wondering, what was your reaction when you heard the government had decided to prorogue? And what was your action, maybe celebration, when you heard the ruling of the courts?
When first I heard that the government had opted for a lengthy prorogation, frankly, I was shocked and horrified. I was by the poolside in Turkey at the time with my family, and I had had no particular premonition of it, and certainly no advance notification from government. The government wasn't obliged to tip me off in advance. It might have been thought to be courteous to do so, but they weren't obliged to do so. So in other words, I don't take my stand, students, on the basis of affronted dignity. That wasn't the issue at all. The fact that I wasn't told about it wasn't the point. The point was that it was absolutely blindingly obvious to me that announcing in the latter part of August that the government intended to prorogue Parliament sometime between the 9th and the 12th of September, only to resume the sitting of the House on the 14th of October, was in order dramatically to restrict the scope for debate on Brexit in the run-up to the European Council on, if memory serves me, the 17th of October. Indeed, it was a point, it seemed to me, that was so blindingly obvious that only an extraordinarily sophisticated person caught up his or her own posterior could fail to grasp it. You'd have to be very over-sophisticated and very lacking in common sense not to realise that that was what the government was about. And I thought that the way in which the government tried to deny that and to say, oh, no, it wasn't about denying opportunities for debate on Brexit was something of an insult to the intelligence. It quite obviously was. And it seemed to me, students, that it was an abuse of the prorogation process. Prorogation ordinarily takes place as a prelude to a state opening of Parliament and a new parliamentary session. It can, to be fair, take place as the immediate precursor to dissolution, that is to say, the end of the Parliament as a whole, and an election, general election, to follow. But to prorogue for that length of time was in recent decades without precedent, and it seemed to me to be an abuse and quite wrong. And if the government had felt that it was justified, it could perfectly well have put that proposition to the House of Commons for a vote. Why didn't the government put that proposition to the House of Commons for a vote? Because they knew perfectly well that they would lose that vote. So instead they decided to go ahead with a piece of chicanery, which I think I described in my statement to the Press Association on August the 28th, as a constitutional outrage. And frankly, students, I stand by that view. It was the wrong thing for the government to do. But you don't have to take it from me. I mean, you just see what happened when the case went to the Supreme Court. And I dare say there are some football fans here. Who's a football fan? Hands up. Only a rather small number. Gosh, you're a very cerebral bunch. You either aren't football fans or you're not prepared to admit to being football fans. It is the Cambridge Union, and it probably regards itself as a bit above football fandom. But let me just put it like this. They didn't just lose the case in the Supreme Court. It wasn't sort of a nip and tuck, close-run thing. Which way is it going to go, 6-5 or 7-4? The government was comprehensively trounced, 11-0. So in answer to the second part of your question, how did I feel when we came back? Well, I confess I did feel vindicated, because I had said at the time that I thought it was totally wrong. It was an active executive fiat. It was not the proper way to treat the House of Commons. And the Speaker is not supposed to be some craven lickspittle of the executive branch. The Speaker is supposed to be an authentic, robust, and hopefully outspoken champion of the rights of Parliament institutionally and members of Parliament individually. So if I remember rightly, when we came back, I did start the proceedings by saying, colleagues, welcome back to our usual place of work. Now, it's an interesting point how governments react when they lose. Did ministers come up to me, one and all, and say, oh, Mr. Speaker, we do apologise. We realise now that we got it quite wrong. We behaved improperly. No. Their view was that they were right, and the court got it wrong, and what a source the Supreme Court had. And that seems to me to underline the imperative of an independent judiciary, because just as no individual office holder can be judge in his or her own cause, I mean, I obviously feel I could do the job of Speaker, and presumably the House did, otherwise it wouldn't have re-elected me 3 times, having elected me first in 2009. I was re-elected in 2010, 2015, and 2017. But it's not for me to say that I was a fine speaker. That's for other people to judge. And some people may think I was a good speaker, and some people may think I wasn't. But equally, the government cannot be judge of its own cause, where the interpretation of the Constitution, and the invocation of procedure is concerned. There has to be another repository of power. There has to be someone who can say no. In the words of the late Lord Denning, that wonderful English judge, be you ever so high, the law is above you. And the fact is that the government, and there could hardly be a higher authority ordinarily day to day than the government, rolled the dice in a way that was widely regarded, I think, as improper, and it was brought to book by the Supreme Court. And did that give me satisfaction that in a modern pluralist democracy we've still got an alternative power centre that can say, sorry, government, what you've done is improper, and it cannot be allowed to stand. I was pleased about that, so much so that when we came back, I remember one of the senior clerks telling me, students with some delight, that the prorogation had not happened. That is to say, Parliament's session had not been ended because the court had so ruled. And the clerk looked at me with a little smile and he said, "Mr. Speaker, in the record of the House, the attempted prorogation must now be expunged." I do like that word, expunged, and it was promptly expunged from the record. I thought I would just use the word 3 times if you don't object. And even if you do.
You use quite a lot of words that most of us wouldn't use quite a lot of the time, and particularly of medicament, which I'm not even sure of the origin of. But do you think that's healthy? You said you did... I mean, not medicament, I mean
well,
other
they're usually
words.
health-giving.
But
or health-restoring.
with your focus on outreach and making Parliament seem modern and involved and pretty substantial reforms you introduced as a speaker, do you not feel that people seeing on their 9 o'clock news somebody using Dickensian language might have undone a little of your hard work?
Well, that's a perfectly fair question. I don't know that it did, but insofar, I don't think it did undo it, because I don't think that people on the whole would say, well, the trouble with Bercow was that he made Parliament completely unintelligible and impenetrable. I don't think people would say that. Indeed, in later years, students, I must admit in particular, I increasingly felt that it was to some extent the duty of the chair when treating of matters relating to rules and procedure, and knowing that the particular point being dealt with at the time was quite opaque. I thought it was part of my role to explain to people in the gallery watching, and by implication to people watching on their television screens or watching Parliament through social media, what exactly was going on, because otherwise some of our procedures and proceedings can be quite hard to follow. I did sometimes reinterpret things. So the fact that I now and again used, as you would say, Dickensian language, I think is sort of part of an overall piece. The truth of the matter is that I suppose I am a slightly curious mix of modernity and tradition. For example, I am utterly useless myself, as any member of my family would tell you, with technology. I can't help it. I've just always been nervous of the new and technologically fairly Philistinic. But I absolutely recognise that technology matters, and I did start to see during my time as Speaker that there were ways in which the House could communicate better with larger groups of people and therefore get a better bang for its buck. And sometimes I could get a better bang for my buck in terms of hours spent by using technology, for example, to Skype with schools. I had a Skype the Speaker session every week with either primary school students or secondary school students, and I think over a period of a couple of years I did about 75 of those. So that was a much more efficient way, not quite as personal, but a much more efficient way of meeting young people than having to trudge off to schools. Now, I did trudge off to schools and I enjoyed doing that, but sometimes, it was just not manageable. They were too far away and there wasn't enough time. So I suppose, on the whole, I think I haven't allowed my own sort of personal inadequacies with things like technology to blind me to the fact that they do matter. They are important. But yeah, I'm a mix. I'm a great believer in modernization, but I'm not a particularly modern person myself. I happen to think that it doesn't matter a flying flamingo if people don't want to wear a tie in the chamber of the House of Commons. I remember at a very early stage in my speakership, my secretary saying to me, "Mr. Speaker, you mustn't call Mr. McCartney at Prime Minister's Questions." And I said, "Sorry, why not?" And he said, "He's not wearing a tie." And to me, students, that didn't matter. I wouldn't have wanted people coming in the chamber wearing football shorts, because that isn't in any sense business attire. But if people wanted to come into the chamber, perhaps with a jacket, but not wearing a tie, that didn't bother me. And eventually, we formally abolished the requirement for people to wear ties, a requirement that applied only to male members anyway. Yeah, I admit that I like ties. I personally enjoy wearing ties. I wear bright ties. I probably almost owe you an apology. I'm wearing a particularly quiet and understated tie today, but I often wear rather garish ties. So you can enjoy a thing yourself, but it doesn't mean that you prescribe it for others, or you can be rather averse to something yourself, like technology, but recognize that actually it's got a key role to play. So I think that although we all naturally tend to judge things in terms of what we do and what our habits are, there is some merit in seeing how other people operate and getting a sort of sense of what you think overall is the preferred wish of a majority in the chamber. Most people in the chamber are completely relaxed about whether other colleagues are wearing ties or not. In fact, most people in the chamber, a lot of the time, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, they're focused, they're resolute, they're determined, they're driven by causes and principles and missions. And most people in the chamber, therefore, are much more preoccupied students with what they are about to say or do than they are much preoccupied with what somebody else is about to say or do.
You've touched a little there on some of your reforms as Speaker. Those reforms met with some internal, say, local difficulty, and out of that situation, out of that internal conflict, allegations have been made about your conduct. Do you have a response to those allegations?
I do. Frankly, when those allegations first surfaced in March 2018, I was absolutely astonished and flabbergasted. Flabbergasted for it to be put to me that I was guilty of bullying a staff member or members. And for the record, I'll reiterate what I've said a number of times in the last couple of years, and again more recently over the last couple of weeks, when a concerted and orchestrated campaign has been waged by critics of mine on this matter. I have never bullied anyone, anywhere, at any time, in any way. What I have done is fought hard for the implementation, Gabriel, of a reform prospectus for which I felt I had a democratic mandate, having been elected as a reformer and re-elected and re-elected and re-elected as a reforming speaker. The vast majority of people with whom I worked were either instinctively and intrinsically supportive of that reform mission, or even if they weren't natural, enthusiastic reformers, they were committed to helping me deliver it. I can think of one person, for example, in my office, in the Speaker's office, who served with me for the whole 10 years, who was the most magnificent staffer, who wouldn't call himself a natural reformer. His attitude, Gabriel, was, my responsibility, Mr. Speaker, whilst always offering you my best advice, is in the end to facilitate what you as Speaker have chosen to do. And he once said to me, this guy, brilliant staffer, if the speakership changed tomorrow and your successor wanted things done very differently, then again, I'd offer my advice and experience, but in the end I would fall in behind the new Speaker's wishes, because that's what I think the staff of the Speaker's office should do. But the great majority, I repeat, would either instinctively have supported me, or they would have said, well, it's my duty to help the Speaker get this agenda. And the great majority of colleagues, parliamentary colleagues, were supportive as well. If something like 70-75% of your employment relationships in the course of a career are successful, you're not doing badly. Relationships don't always work, and the fact that a particular relationship might not work, and a small number of mine, a very small minority, didn't, doesn't mean that one person maltreated another. It means just that particular relationship didn't work because there was an incompatibility, there were clashing objectives, there in some cases might have been irreconcilable personal differences or whatever. The media have never been interested, though if they were fair-minded they should be, in the fact that the great majority of people who worked in my office did so extremely successfully. Several of them kept in touch even when they'd left for years. Large numbers came back to my retirement party, came to view the last Prime Minister's questions. I'm still in touch with several of them. And a number of them are absolutely, likewise, bemused and astonished by the allegations of bullying. I had a small number of people who were reform resistant, and on the whole, they were institutionalized. They'd either been in Parliament or in another role or career for a very, very, very long time. They tended to be posh, snobbish, entitled, and long-versed, not only in having their say, but in having their way. And when I, as the elected speaker, said, well, no, we're not going to do it like that, we're going to do it like this, they didn't like it. And some of those people have been hostile ever since, and they are now peddling their hostility through leaks to the media and off-the-record briefings and carefully timed complaints. And I think their behavior says a lot more about them than it does about me. And my final observation on this matter I'm authorized to share with you is this. I appointed the first female and BAME Speaker's Chaplain, the Right Reverend Rose Hudson Wilkin, in the history of the House of Commons. And we worked together for 9 years, saw each other the great majority of working days during that 9-year period. Recently, to my delight, I take vicarious pride, students, in this, Rose has become the Bishop of Dover. Rose Hudson Wilkin has made very clear to a number of people, and she's certainly said to me, I can share it with you, the following. She feels she knows me very well. We work closely together. As she put it to me, John, if I thought that I ever witnessed from you anything in any scenario or meeting that even approximated to bullying, I would have called you out on it. I would have said to you, that wasn't the right way to behave, you've got to do it differently. I didn't call you out on such behavior because I never witnessed such behavior, and such behavior simply does not square with all my experience and understanding of you. That's Rose's verdict, and I've got a lot more time for Rose than for some of the people whom I've just described who've been picking a fight in recent times. If they want to pick a fight, I can't stop them. You can have different views about my record, but I will fight to my dying breath to defend my reputation as somebody who did an honest job to the best of my ability and had very, very good relations with the vast majority of people with whom I worked. I never have been, I am not, and I never will be a bully.
One final question before we move to the floor. What's the naughtiest thing you've ever done?
There was a particularly disagreeable primary school teacher of mine who was also mildly sadistic, at whom I deliberately kicked the football as hard as I could in the hope of inflicting some injury upon him. He was, because I remember where the ball caught him, in some danger of having a more high-pitched voice as a result of my kick. And I wasn't, at the time, I think, completely candid with him on the matter. In other words, I don't think I volunteered to him that it was deliberately aimed at him. But it was. However, that was in 1973. So I hope, given the lapse of 47 years since, it will not be held against me. Actually, on a more serious note, Gabriel, there is one thing that I did in the past, which I've often spoken about and which I think is very much more seriously reprehensible. I've had a journey in my political career. I started on the hard right and I moved towards the centre over a long period. I'm much more liberal-minded now. I never wanted to be a member of any party other than the Conservative Party, but I became much more liberal-minded and centrist over the years. When I was first involved in politics, reprehensibly and despicably and incredibly stupidly, I was drawn to the hard right and to the speeches and writings of Enoch Powell, the late Enoch Powell, who was massively anti-immigration and in favor of the repatriation of new Commonwealth and Pakistani immigrants. And I joined the Monday Club, which supported that agenda in 1981. And it was only really when I found there was a clash between the abstractly political and the personal that I decided to look for the exit door. And the personal was that I found there were quite a lot of people in the Monday Club, surprise, surprise, I should have known this in advance, who were not only anti-black and Asian immigration into the UK, but also anti-Semitic, and I am myself of Jewish origin. I had no business joining that organization in the first place. It was a spectacularly misguided and foolish and objectionable thing to do, for which I've many times apologized over the years. But I did leave in 1984, 36 years ago. So on the assumption that most of the august and cerebral members of the Cambridge Union Society believe in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1974, I would hope that I can be forgiven for my youthful stupidity.